My name is Eitan Buckman. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at the Freightos Group. And as if you've joined us for the past couple of webinars, you know this is somewhat something of a passion project for me, mostly because during the course of COVID, while sitting at home, I tried to figure out what would really keep me entertained. I'm not a huge fan of webinars, not a huge fan of tuning in to things, but I am a huge fan of logistics technology. And it's really fun to just have the opportunity to get other people that are passionate about logistics technology and not just talk to them and interview them, ask them the questions that are on my mind, but also to see the questions that people ask in real time. So this is a good reminder that if you have any questions during the course of the webinar that you want me or Biju to touch on, please don't hesitate to drop it in the Q&A section. I can't promise that I'll get to every single one of them, but I will try to get to as many as possible. So today we're going to talk about the future of freight forwarding. If you recall, the first episode of this series started off with Eric Johnson from the Journal of Commerce. We talked a little bit about general trends. 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Beluza from Hapag-Lloyd talking about how carriers, specifically ocean liners, are contending with changing patterns. And today I'm really excited to host Biju Kewalram, who is the Chief Digital, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who is the Chief Digital and Transformation Officer at Agility. Biju, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate that. Nothing like a great fireside chat at 7 a.m. in the morning, California time.
I was going to call that out. That I like logistics technology. I don't like it at 7 in the morning. So,
no, it's fine.
So you're the true hero here. Biju, why don't you just take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of the journey that led you to being the Chief Digital Officer at Agility.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Ethan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and also, of course, anytime I get to talk about myself is a welcome opportunity, right? No. Only joking. So I've been in the industry for about 30 plus years now in a variety of roles. I started out with a software startup in Australia, which I exited after a build and sell that brought me to the US. And what was intended to then be a 6-month assignment in the US now turned into a 20-year assignment, as these things go. But over the last 20 years after the software exit, the software is always aimed at the logistics industry. And after that, I had a variety of commercial roles, Chief Information Officer, Chief Operations Officer, and then the co-CEO for a logistics company. About 6 years ago, I joined Agility with the intention of participating in a project, and that over time led to a Chief Digital Officer role, and that's what brings me to California and Agility in the thumbnail.
Perfect. Okay, great. So, and I think what's really interesting here, last week when we had Dr. Beluza from Hapag-Lloyd, he came from tech, but not from inside of logistics. And I'm sure that the perspective of growing up inside of the logistics sector, even if it's coming from the tech side rather than necessarily within the logistics side, kind of was an interesting shaper of the way that you approach this. So I'd love to touch on that in some of the questions that we have coming up. Just a reminder, if this is the first time for listeners here, and you weren't in our previous previous episodes, the structure of this is pretty straightforward. Basically, we'll touch on a data point or two. I'll ask Biju for his opinion on something. We'll go back and forth and talk about it. Again, if you have questions, that's the perfect time to chime in. And then we'll finish it up with a rapid fire Q&A based on mostly the questions that were asked in advance. So, just a word about the Freightos Group as a whole. The Freightos Group really consists of two main units. The first is Web Cargo, that focuses on connecting carriers and logistics providers with pricing and routing and e-booking automation. The second is Freightos.com, which is the world's largest digital freight marketplace. And all of that is to say that we spend a lot of time thinking about the convergence between how do carriers and freight forwarders and BCOs, the small ones, the really large ones, all interact. This is our bread and butter, and it's really, really interesting, especially as we're on the cusp of an industry that is changing in a lot of different ways. And I think there's no better place, kind of the tip of the iceberg, above all of the technology stacks that are under the water. The earliest indicator of how that change is happening and how it's customer facing is really just who's selling online right now. Right? Where can you go and get instant quotes? Where can you book them? The carriers are on board, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC as of last week. Agility is certainly there with regard to ship a freight. Kuehne+Nagel has been doing it for a while as well. Beacon, a new digital freight forwarder that launched last month, Flexport, of course, and Forto, which used to be Freight Hub. And I guess one of the things that comes up, and I would say a good 20% of the questions that we got in advance, is that it really seems like tech is making it much easier for new players to play in this space. And it's also helping the older players kind of change their approach. So I think what everybody's looking at right now is, well, where is their competitive advantages? How, when you look at the ecosystem, Biju, when you look at who agility goes after and who agility wants to go after, where can freight forwarders today find that competitive advantage?
Oh, okay, thanks. Some of the merger and acquisition activity that's been happening in the last few months at least has all been about tech startups and tech platforms being acquired by the traditional forwarders, and I think that's a key point to make here, because the term digital forwarders, that's a recent trend, but what does that necessarily mean? It feels a little bit like it's a label that's been adopted by some of the new entrants and startups, like tech organizations do. But is it a true disruption or a new business model? I think not. It's not like Uber is suddenly starting to make everybody an ocean carrier, right? It's not. That's not what's on offer. I think it's more about digital has become a web-friendly way of doing business, but the business model, the value chain, etc., is still the same. And it's still about balancing capacity, supply and demand, utilization, load factors, the geographical spread, the ability to deliver consistent service across geographies. That business model is still intact. Now, with COVID, trade wars, other factors pushing towards diversity of supply, it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the companies with the broadest networks in freight forwarding are going to provide better resilience for supply chains, and that's been proven. So I think the competitive advantage still comes from the established network, the ability to flex that network to suit the customer's specific needs, become part of a customer supply chain, to help customers build resilience in the supply chains. And that's where I think if you add a tech stack and look at where some of these acquisitions have occurred, I think tech is an enabler for established players that can take advantage of it. And of course, there are advantages to the tech world in terms of a startup mentality and what that brings to the orientation of the freight forwarder, and the additional advantage that plays out. The most likely way this plays out is that established forwarders are able to incorporate the lean aspects of a startup mentality to keep strengthening their digital platforms, and participation in the customer's digitization. I think that's a key point for continuing to maintain that competitive advantage in supply chain.
So actually, can I ask you a question about that? Does that mean that you're basically visualizing this as we have this asset-based layer, right, or at least a global geographic layer, and then on top of that you have a technology layer?
Yeah.
And when you combine both of those together, they're magnified much more than any one of those layers by themselves.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what that source of competitive advantage is. But it's not. I'm not seeing a pure tech play that relies on some sort of virtual network resulting in a disruption or a disruptive force that completely changes the way the industry works. Right?
Because I think a lot of companies kind of look at logistics, right? You look at it from the way that you look at a investor pitch deck, and you say, well, logistics, it's a huge industry. We'll pull out, the stupid 90% of everything, $1 trillion industry, the same things that show up in a lot of investor decks, I imagine, around the world. And then they'll say it's ripe for disruption. It's very old school. And then they find it's much easier to move bits than it is to move boxes, right?
Yeah. And the new entrants help that message, because they brand themselves in a certain way, and then they talk about how the industry is still using faxing, the industry is still old-fashioned, and so on. I think it comes from that pitch deck, and that's where I think the startup world meets the traditional so-called hidebound industry. The same with agility. Shipper Freight, for example, is actually it's our startup within an established network, and we intentionally set out Shipper Freight in a startup world in order to be able to have that startup mentality and complement what we've done in the past with the traditional network.
So, I think that was definitely one of the things that was on my mind when I look at Shipper Freight. It's so clear that it's run as a very different brand. I think this is something that a couple of companies have done, kind of similar ideas. Maersk's taken Twill as a brand and done that. What are the disadvantages of taking a model like that? Like, is it, I can clearly see the advantages. You have a smaller group of people, they can run fast, they have, they have bankroll from a larger company, they have the assets that they can tap into and the experience. What are the disadvantages of a model like that?
I think, well, there are obviously going to be disadvantages when you bring two different operating modes and cultures together. And I think that's really where the biggest rub is, or where the biggest friction is, because you're talking about rapid iteration, you're talking about quick changes, etc. But in reality, the leverage that Agility's network globally gives Shipper, and Shipper Freight in turn gives Agility the business and the ability to keep going with the business while layering on. I think it generates more advantages than disadvantages. It's about mastering the culture meld, and if you can do that, then it's a winning formula. But the risk is if you cannot get that startup world and the traditional world to combine, because the problem is that you could be creating an experience expectation with the customer that you can't meet. And that's where the problem occurs in most other cases. Shipper Freight, and I know you want to talk about that a little bit more coming up, and we'll talk about where that's been, but Shipper Freight has been a successful exercise for Agility because the traditional business, when we did a whole lot of agile training and a whole lot of thinking and so on, the traditional business was able to adapt to that iterative model, and that's where the advantage came from.
Mm-hmm. And I think one interesting thing that I've been watching over the past 5 or 6 years now is that you'll basically have every industry, not even in logistics. If I think 6 years ago, there was innovative apps for checking your email that let you swipe right or swipe left to archive, and then one or two people see that, and then that becomes the industry standard across every email tool. And do you feel like that same idea, like maybe that's the best place to take advantage of startups or kind of leverage the fact that there are startups that are trying to rethink the wheel? Like, do you see that shift of, hey, I see somebody else is doing something interesting, let me try to do that? And then I think more importantly, do you see that trend happening in the Shippa and Agility connection where Shippa tries something new and you integrate that into the Agility kind of procedures?
Yeah, well, that's an intended outcome. And many times it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it is definitely forcing that the rethink. I mean, take SEO or search engine optimization, right? That's not necessarily the way that the traditional network-based business thinks. It doesn't need to. But as we rolled out Shipper Freight and as we learned the lessons, it became obvious that we would need to think that through very carefully. And that introduced a need for the rest of the business to start setting up its own social media and its own ability to enable that search engine optimization in support of the digital marketing that the startup was doing. So there have been flow-on effects, and I think it's very clear now that the network-based business talks a lot about how to support and build that aspect. And I think that kind of innovation is inevitable. It's not, it's also being supported by the fact that we're all personally undergoing changes and responding to tech. The swipe right, swipe left effect is there in our personal lives, and it flows through. So the conversations I have, those conversations are all about in the network business, talking about how to support that digital and startup world.
Mm-hmm. And before we move to the next slide, I see Sebastian's asked a question here about kind of the resource allocation between Shippa and Agility. Does Shipper Freight benefit from using the Agility like import and export clerks, or is it two totally separate businesses?
No, we've got the technology development is done in that startup world, but the interface between the organizations is at the technical layer. So we've had a very strong in-house enterprise operating system for the longest time, and the link that occurs in our pricing into Shipper Freight, in the way that the operations delivers the traditional service online, in the ocean, in the air freight, the leveraging. There are nominated people within our network-based business that work with Shipper Freight to provide the knowledge and that integration required. So it's not just a separate startup. And I think that's a key lesson in the learning. You cannot just have that startup operate completely on its own. It doesn't work.
Right. And that probably also means that down the line, if it ever becomes more of a land and expansion idea with, kind of finding regional digital freight forwarders around the world and incorporating them, that gets a little bit harder. I guess the biggest advantage of Ship it was homegrown. So you guys have this very tight integrated idea. Okay, I want to keep on actually moving, and this kind of touches on the Ship Freight idea a little bit. This is just kind of a couple of interesting snapshots from the Agility website. But really, I think this represents the ship idea in general represents this really interesting way of recognizing that we have a large organization. It might not be able to move as quickly, so we need to kind of inject some way to speed it up a little bit. And I think I've seen this as well, where you might have the underlying technology to say sell freight services online, but the cultural kickback against that is really, really hard, and it's hard to move forward. So I'm wondering, in your role, where not just chief digital officer, but transformation, and you're tasked with transforming an organization, how do you go out there and make sure that both culture and technology move in the same way so that you can push that change across the entire company?
So let me start by thanking you for going to our website to get this material, because you've helped our search engine optimization just a little bit by giving us a few more page hits, right? So
I didn't backlink yet. We'll talk about it after.
Yeah. So look, this is an important point, and I'm glad you talked about it. It's a passion of mine, because there is what I call the organizational mindset at play here. There are enough methods or frameworks, if you like, that bridge the two. Many of the people on this call and out in the world that are trying to build a tech layer on top of that network layer are familiar with Agile, for example. Agile is a framework with a manifesto, principles, and an adoption of a process, set of small teams, etc. But many companies start down this path and they don't finish the journey, because the journey ends with a change in an organizational mindset. Now, the organizational mindset is an aggregate of the mindset that's occurring within the leadership of the company. It's hard enough to get two people that are strong-minded to agree to anything to start with, leave alone change an organization's mindset. I mean, two people, you ask my wife, right? We have strong-willed discussions, and it's hard enough to get a household to move forward. You get people that come in the workplace, and that's probably where the most significant challenge is. So what we did was we started with Agile training at the board level, with actual Agile certification program, and then cascaded that down. But the key message we kept delivering was, it's not about the process, it's about the mindset. And once that message sinks in, then we find that there are other aspects, like, for example, when COVID came along and we had to launch within days a new website that kept our customers informed, we took the Agile adoption approach. They didn't even come to me. It was already in the mindset. So many companies start down this path, but few finish the journey, because it's about going from process to mindset. And then there's a build-up on that as well, right? When you're trying to meld culture and tech. For example, the next stage up from Agile is DevOps, which is really development and operations in IT, combining with business to build a continuous deployment and continuous implementation pipeline. And even fewer companies go to that extent, which is hard to understand when the efficiency in DevOps has been proved time and again. I think that is where this industry probably has the biggest challenge, is no trouble in starting the journey, but finishing that journey in order to combine that culture and tech is where that mindset comes. That's how I think that culture and tech, and that's some of the things that we did was recognize that and build that from the top down. Agility is somewhat blessed in that all the way up at the top, there is a common view and there is an ability to cascade it down through both the logistics and the startup world. So there are frequent interactions, and there's a whole lot of alignment, which is key to how it works.
Mm-hmm.
If I had one word to take away from this, culture and tech are both key. What's the key? I would say it's alignment and continuous alignment.
Mm-hmm. And is that something that you specifically hire for, teach, or is it just it needs to permeate everywhere? Like everybody needs to be thinking about alignment. Like when you bring in a new player, do you look for digital experience, or do you look more like what are you prioritizing? Yeah.
Well, certainly, Shipper Freight, when it's hiring, is looking for that mindset, looking for that startup world. And within our leadership, we're also, when we recruit, we look to ask the questions. Have you been exposed to this? And many times, we will hire, for example, when companies have gone through a merger and acquisition, that throw out potential staff members that we can then bring on team members. And what we're finding is that we often get a yes to the question agile,
Mm-hmm.
but that's about being exposed to the agile process and not the agile mindset. Right? That's why I
Mm-hmm.
keep driving that message is you've got to finish that journey. So we hire for it. We have an in-house certification program that we're quite proud of, because we set it up so that we would not only provide the training, but we would also support the individuals going out and getting that certification online. And to date, there's over 300 people that are certified in those methods within the organization and can put that against their title with a certified model. So
I love that. I think that's actually the first time I've heard of a really concrete action item being taken in order to make sure that you get people thinking in that mindset. Let's keep on moving to the next question here, because I know we have a lot of things to cover here. From my side, I think we're at this point in the industry where it used to be a big deal for a new startup in the space to launch, or for a new company to announce that they're embarking on this big tech investment or internal tech process. It feels like in general there's like this perfect storm of digital logistics focus. Why do you think that has come of age, and what do you feel like are the core components of that digital revolution?
So, just to start at the highest level when it comes to digital transformation, not just in the logistics industry, not just in freight forwarding, but the three key laws of digital transformation, as I refer to them, they've always been at play, right? Moore's law, which says that the rate of the computing power is going to double every 18 months. There's Butter's law, which says that every 9 months, the capacity of communication is going to get faster and faster, probably even more so now with 5G and other aspects coming out. And then there's Kreider's law, which says that storage will continue, right? Growing, doubling every 13 months, I think it is. So we've got that doubling exponential effect in all of those components, the network, the bandwidth, the telecommunications, the computing power, and the storage. And I think those are combining in particular to increase the level of data. So why now? I think that you call it a perfect storm, and I think that makes sense. It's about convergence of those three trends and the realization of the data value. And I think that realization of data, the data science aspect, is what's driving this. Because if you look at it, all the trends, you ask what are the key types of tech that will impact the industry. The key tech areas that I think impact the industry are impacting that data. We need trustable data. The data has got to be highly trusted so that we can have smart contracts. Well, that's going to lead you to blockchain.
You said it. That's everybody with the bingo. If you have the tech bingo card, you can chat off the blockchain. Okay.
Well, here's the next one that you can go check the bingo on, which is, in addition to trustable data, you want data at all points in the supply chain. Okay. So here you go. You've got IoT, the Internet of Things, RFID, tags, visibility, and so on. But that's about an aspect of data. It's about data at all points and continuous data availability. The third one is, I think, a big impact and sometimes ignored is how do you digitize data when it enters the pipeline and is not coming from a device like the Internet of Things. And this is where we're doing a considerable amount of work with robotic process automation, or RPA. That technology has reached maturity now, and we've been able to incorporate that quite successfully. because what you want to do is you want to reduce the human touch as much as possible. And so what this does is it closes that loop. So you've got those three technologies working together. And the fourth one is the data science aspect. How do you get value out of that with actually being able to do predictive analytics and big data? And all, big data is a little bit of a confusing term because it's not about the size of the data, it's about the multiple sources of data. So you take those four things, and we have an acronym, by the way, at Agility. We call it BIRD, or the BIRD technologies, BIRD, which is blockchain, IoT, RPA, and data science. And I think that those are the types of tech that are going to impact us working in conjunction and in convergence. So, if you keep the BIRD acronym in mind, then you basically effectively read every article that I've written on that subject. Other technologies that are at play today in our space are virtual reality, robotics. We read a lot about warehouses being very, very successful implementation of these emerging technologies, rapidly reaching maturity and the adoption gap, but they tend to be within specific segments of the chain. Okay, robotics, and none of our offices in the network is got a robot running around unless it's the Roomba that's running a vacuum cleaner in the office, right? But we're still about information management, and that's why I think my emphasis is on those four technologies, the BIRD technologies, because I see that robotics in our warehouses, yes, but if you're talking across the chain and across the industry, then I would suggest thinking about those four technologies working in hand in terms of BIRD.
Well, and I love, at the end of the day, there are four different technologies. I think the idea that you're getting data in, that's your I and the R, are both data coming in from different sources. Then you have the big data analysis and actually turning that into valuable data, and then blockchain as a way to store it. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that the freight industry has always had and has really made, I agree with you, a ton of strides on that, is legibility, right? This is the real technology that's out there. If you think of autonomous cars, the big change is legibility, the ability to input what's happening on the street and see what's happening. A Roomba, the ability to be able to see what's happening around your house. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think that was always the stumbling block. And I think that, from my side at least, I think that was one of the biggest changes that changed over the last 10 years, where suddenly all the data is structured, it's processed. There is one question I saw from Julie here, who basically asks a little bit about how come original bills of lading and telex releases are still out there. And if you had to hazard a date of death for the telex, where would you put that? Is that a year away, 10 years away, 20 years away, and will it be missed?
It's gonna take a braver guy than me to make that kind of detailed prediction. I mean, the death of telex has been been talked about for the last 20, 25 years. I come at that a little bit differently. I'd come at that with why does it matter? I know it feels like an outdated way of doing things, but until the three aspects that I talked about earlier, the Moore's Law, Butter's Law, Kreider's Law, I think particularly in terms of that communication layer, Butter's Law, until that is ubiquitous in every country, I think that aspects like telex will continue. I think we're not there yet. It's hard to say when it will happen. I don't think it's a year. I think it's more like 5 years, but that is purely speculative. And I've been saying that every 5 years I update that to the next 5 years.
Another 5 years.
Yeah, but the question is, why does it matter? And look at telex. Telex has survived largely because it is still highly secure. It is still trusted. That's the comment I made about blockchain. And it is reliable. And that's a comment I made about telecommunications. So until that convergence occurs in every country, I think we will still see the weakest link continue to support that kind of technology.
All right, cool. And I'm going to skip this last question because I really want to get to these rapid questions. Try to get these and answers to these in 30 seconds to 60 seconds because I want to be mindful of the time that we want to end at. So what's your point of view on growing commoditization of value-added services?
I think if we look at our recent past, if COVID has demonstrated anything, it is that every industry has a trend towards commoditization. Commoditization is a directional trend until it isn't. And we learned that with COVID. We learned that relationships matter. We learned that differentiation matters during COVID. Complex supply chains are constantly threatened with disruption. You get port strikes in Long Beach, you get floods, earthquakes, political disruptions, tariff wars, all those items. New technology is also a disruptive force. So I think the key is there is a tendency to think of it as growing commoditization, but I think the response comes from maybe something like continuous differentiation. As long as there is change, the opportunity to provide differentiation is always there. It's not to say that efficiencies in supply chain are not driving costs down, but that's different from commoditization, where one service provider's offerings cannot be differentiated from another. It's probably fair to say that tech is introducing greater opportunities for the digitally capable participants to differentiate themselves. My point of view is I tend to see tech as a way to respond to the commoditization risk, but I also see that it can be over-assessed as a risk in terms of commoditization. I think that ability to differentiate, we do it with shipper freight. We do it with the fact that we make compliance now available in a self-service mode through shipper freight. We do it through the ability to configure our systems to have customized customer onboarding. I think that opportunity will always be there for companies that adapt to that digital space.
Awesome. What's your favorite pizza topping?
Yeah. This is, I made a passing reference to ask my wife, but I'm an everything kind of guy.
Bold.
I find it hard. We have a place here called Pyology, which lets you pick your own toppings. And I'll have that and that. And they asked me this question, do you want barbecue sauce or tomato sauce? And I'm like, what's the question? Give me both, So I think it's hard for me to pick a favorite pizza topping. I'm a everything bagel, everything pizza topping kind of guy.
All right, more discerning about technology than pizza toppings. Great.
So.
How do you feel like Amazon is impacting the forwarding space in a rapid U-turn from that previous question? It's been interesting watching the wave of conversation about Amazon. There was a lot of talk about Amazon buying aircraft, getting an NVO license in China, etc. But if you look at it, those were isolated moves. The move into owning and controlling aircraft was a U.S. domestic move. They moved business away from FedEx, insourcing. That led to massive savings. The quoted figure is something like $2 billion. But cross-border e-commerce is the fastest growing part of global trade today, as the statistics show. And that was pre-COVID, right? So I don't think there is an impact from Amazon on the international freight forwarding space. In this segment, Amazon still works with both express operators and freight forwarders because it's smaller volumes. And remember what I said earlier about the business model is still the same. Our freight forwarding business model is still about consolidation. It's about leverage. It's about yields. It's about capacity supply. So I think that what Amazon has done, right, the Amazon effect, is they've done two things. One is they've raised the expectation of service levels with that online transaction. So, shipper freight, we've got to try and recreate that high level of customer interaction, particularly in self-service mode for the small to medium enterprises. So they've done that. They've raised the barrier in that digital space. And the other thing I think they've done is when you deal with Amazon, the SMEs, even the freight forwarders that are helping to deliver freight in, there is an expectation of a digital layer and a standard interface. And I think what they're doing is they're introducing and forcing rapid adoption and standardization of that integrative technology. So I think those are the two or three areas where it's more immediate in terms of the impact. Right? Yeah, and I think that structure and standardization. We talked a little bit last week about DCSA and different standardization efforts within the industry. But my sense is always the only way standards actually take place is not a consortium that pushes a standard. It's when your customers come to you and say, no, I need you to adhere to the standard, right? When there's money on the table, that's what gets people on board with standards. Your favorite business book? We have two more questions here.
This is going to show my age. I find it hard to move. I think the best business book that I have ever read was In Search of Excellence. It's very old. It shows my age. It was what, an 80s book. But I found that inspiring. I found the way that it looked at American business. And at that stage, I was in Australia doing my startup. And it was like a cheat sheet for how to steal the American business model. I love that book. That's by far my favorite business. I am going to also add here, for those that are interested in tech, you cannot go much past the Phoenix Project. I'd recommend that as essential reading because I referred to DevOps earlier. And the Phoenix Project is a great starting point. It's the same way as The Goal. It's a fable written for business terms, but I highly recommend it's a quick read. And so that's what I like to read.
Awesome.
I follow Bill Gates' annual list of books to read too.
Yep, they're great. Okay, well, last question here. What do you think the lessons from COVID will be for the logistics sector?
I think COVID it's been an enlightening experience. I think the first lesson is the resilience in supply chains comes from information. When the true crisis hit, we used, as I said, agile principles. We threw up a new COVID-specific website, and we were giving customers information within days on port-by-port restrictions, where freight was moving, where it was not, where specific restrictions were available and applicable, where there was capacity building in air freight and ocean freight, and where there was a underrun. So I think that resilience in supply chains comes from information. I think that's takeaway number one. Number two probably is that relationships still matter. It takes a crisis to realize that years spent in relationship building matter a lot. And the third one that surprised me was a new normal is always possible. And I get tired of people telling me that freight forwarding and logistics is a traditional hidebound industry using faxes, all that marketing, because the way that we reacted to suddenly processing trucking orders, routing freight, reorganizing shipments, finding capacity, consolidating freight, all of this in a work from home environment, precipitated by a crisis, you've got to think that this is a resilient industry. So those are my three key takeaways if I had to list them. Resilience from information, relationships matter, and a new normal is always possible.
Those are incredibly insightful. I think those are all great lessons to take away. Biju, this has been a fascinating fascinating kind of conversation. We have a bunch of questions that we didn't get to. Maybe if I can email them over to you afterwards, we can try to send out some responses from your side to everybody that participated. I want to thank you for taking your time and sharing things, especially this early in the morning. Really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed connecting, and it's a passion area, so you could keep me going for hours, but I don't think you want to do that.
I kind of do, but we'll end it now. Biju, thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants. We'll be doing this again in another 2 weeks. I have a surprise guest we'll be announcing in another 2 days. We'll be sending out the video recording of this in a couple of days as well. So thank you very much and have a great day. Bye, Biju.
Thank you all.